Hey, everybody. Welcome to our regular Wednesday Live, sponsored by the Alliance for Lifetime Income. I'm Jean Chatzky. I'm very excited to be with all of you as usual, but I'm even more excited because I have an awesome guest today. Please meet Ben Harris. He is Executive Director of the Kellogg Public-Private Initiative at the Kellogg School of Management. He is the chief economist at Results for America, which is an evidence-based policy organization. He worked in the Obama administration as chief economist and the economic advisor to the vice president, and is continuing, it's been reported widely, to work heavily on the campaign, Joe Biden's campaign for president today. Ben, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
I should also mention you are a fellow for the Alliance for Lifetime Income, so that is that's terrific as well. And I know you're here today talking about your own views and not necessarily the views of the campaign.
Yes.
Retirement right now is an interesting quandary. I want to dig into that, but before we even get there, can we talk about just what is going on right now in the economy, in Congress? I was pulling headlines from CNBC before you and I took to the air. We don't seem to have any sort of consensus on an additional round of stimulus. You know, as you look at where the economy stands, what's your take? Where are we?
So maybe we'll talk about the economy first and then talk about Congress second. The economy, it's really tough to characterize what's going on because there's so much uncertainty, and we have never in our country's history lived through anything like this. When this all started, I think the expectation was we would have this V-shaped recovery. And you hear all economists and commentators try to assign a letter to the shape of the recovery just to sort of describe it in an easily accessible way. We thought there was going to be this V-shaped recovery, which was going to be a few months of just a shutdown. We would defeat the virus, and then we'd come roaring back. And so a lot of the policies that were designed were designed with that in mind. We had the PPP program for small businesses, which was designed originally to give about 2 months support for small businesses to keep their payrolls going. We had this plus up in unemployment insurance, which was going to give $600 extra per person, but it was just limited until the end of July. So, right now in the economy, though, we have not had a V-shaped recovery at all. We have what's more accurately described as a K-shaped recovery, and K because there's some people who are just doing just fine. If you're a professional investor, if you have a small business that's not in hospitality or retail or a restaurant, you may be doing fine. But on the flip side, we have 28 million people. That's such a big number. It's almost hard to fathom. 28 million people collecting unemployment insurance. 1/5 of small businesses that were open prior to the pandemic are still closed. That's just another number that I never thought we'd say in our lifetime. It's almost hard to conceive of how big the shutdown has been. And we are not in a V-shaped recovery. We're in a K-shaped recovery because some people, are still out of work. And some people are doing fine. And that's sort of the way I would characterize today's economy. With Congress, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've never been right when I predict what Congress will do. But I will say, going back 2 months, 3 months, I thought there was no chance we would not have a follow-up bill to the CARES Act. So the CARES Act was the signature package which came out of Congress and gave the higher unemployment insurance, gave support for small businesses, extended a lifeline for big businesses to borrow from. But the idea was, look, we would wait and see a few months, then have another plan. And here we are. Unemployment insurance has dried up. Small businesses are out of cash, and who knows if there'll be another package coming out of Congress. So it's just characterized by tons of uncertainty.
Yeah, I read the headlines, and let's say hello to all these people who are joining us. Very nice to have all of you here, Barry and Sonia and Lisa and Janet and everybody. We welcome your questions. I read these stories every day about how they haven't been able to come to an agreement, and it's so surprising to me because I think when we look at back to the economy for a second, and the fact that the economy has actually held up much better than people anticipated, you have to credit that additional $600 in people's pockets. You have to credit the PPP with the fact that people have continued in many cases to spend.
Yeah, and so when you look at sort of the national accounting, and then we think about how much money is being shifted from governments and with wages. In the second quarter of this year, we had a little over $1 trillion in lost wages and lost small business income. But we had 2.4 trillion in government support, so more than double the amount of lost wages. So you had this huge amount of government support coming in for small business owners and for people who are unemployed and other government assistance. And so what happened is, in a sort of bizarre way, that forestalled the effects of the recession. And the recession is now just starting for many people, because while they were laid off, they still had the income, or even better than they had before. But for many people, the recession starts August 2020 because they lose their higher unemployment checks, they lose their small business support. State and local governments have run out of money. Congress and the CARES Act gave them about $150 billion. That's nowhere near sufficient to keep them going. So, it's sort of sad to say, but we had this sort of national pause, but government support made people whole. And then today, August, September 2020 is when the recession is really getting started.
So what does that mean as we look out into the future? I mean, what will it take to have a real recovery? And what happens to the financial lives that people have worked so hard to build for decades in the interim?
It is a scary situation right now. The first answer is that in order to get our economy back on track, we've got to get the virus under control. You cannot have an economic recovery until you have this health-based recovery. And we've had lots of different reasons for recessions before in our country's history. We've had energy shocks, we had terrorist attacks, we had the financial meltdown in 2007, 2008. But this is the first one that's really been led by health-related concerns, and it's not going to get fixed until people feel safe going out, until people feel safe sending their kids to school. We've got to get it under control. Otherwise, the economic pain is just going to get worse and worse and worse. And the problem now is that a lot of the people who are going to come back to work have come back to work. And so, we're looking at an unemployment rate of about 10%, plus another 5 million people that have just left the labor force altogether. And the scary part is that it's not necessarily going to come back quickly, and it's not necessarily going to come back at all, particularly for small business owners who have, like you said, Jean, worked for decades to build up these businesses and are just seeing them fall apart, at no fault of their own.
So actually, can you explain that just a little bit in more detail? When you talk about the unemployment rate and it's sitting around 10%, those extra 5 million people who've given up, they're not counted, correct?
Exactly. And so that's, there are a lot of flaws in the way we measure unemployment. And I think that we've got to think of a new metric to talk about it. I mean, in a world of Uber and gig work, what does it mean to be unemployed? I mean, anyone with a car can sign up for Uber to be a driver and get a job. So, a lot of the official statistics don't really tell the whole story. If you're working part-time, that's not captured in the headline unemployment rate. And like you said, Jean, if you just decide to drop out of the labor market, which right now makes sense for a lot of people because they don't feel safe being in a job, or maybe they're just so discouraged they think that they can't even find a job in the first place, that person, those 5 million workers that have dropped out, are not counted as unemployed. So when you start accounting for all these different factors, we're really more at like 13 or 14%, which is much higher than we ever saw in the Great Recession, which for many of us, we thought was going to be the worst labor market shakeup we would ever see. And here we are 10 years later, and it's even worse.
Yeah. Lisa asked a question, what will happen to the cruise industry? Will they reinvent themselves, and resorts and casinos? And I think that's just part and parcel with what you're saying about this is all vaccine dependent. This is all dependent on getting a grip on the virus.
Yes. And you have all this speculation right now that things will change for good, that will never go back to the same, that cities are emptying out, that will, commercial real estate will be hurt because no one wants to go to an office anymore. I'm personally a little bit skeptical about the magnitude of those claims. I mean, clearly things will change. It's just thinking through the change we've made already. I mean, we cannot leave this country right now, right? If you have a passport, it doesn't mean anything. You can't even travel. And so, for businesses that have been experimenting with virtual work, obviously things will change. But for things like the cruise industry, I mean, more optimistic about that coming back. But what I'm really worried about is honestly the small businesses and the workers who have this, what we call a scarring effect. And once you're unemployed for a long period of time, or once you've shut down a business, it's really, really hard to get back to where you were. And it's not just that. I mean, right now we've got 15% of families are food insecure, which is 3 or 4 times higher than we saw just a couple of years ago. And if you have to go stand online to get food for the first time in your life, or you're one of these 28 million workers who has to apply for unemployment insurance, many for the first time in your life, I mean, that sticks with you. That is a transformative experience, and not in a good way. And so that's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about the scarring for workers, the scarring for small business owners, and the scarring for families and children. We haven't even talked about children who right now are having their development stunted. So I'm less worried about the industry and more worried about the people.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And if we look back at the Great Recession, what we saw in that generation of kids who came out of college unable to get jobs, who saw their parents lose a good deal of their retirement savings, is that they are very risk averse, much more risk averse than other generations, and were not eager to start investing in stocks. We're not eager to buy homes. I mean, it took a good 10 years to get them to the point where they were ready to dip a toe in the water. And I think this has the potential to be worse. But let's talk about something happier. No, I'm a fan. Look, I am a fan, even in bad times, of trying to figure out where is the element that we actually can control, right? We can't control the markets. We can't control inflation. We certainly can't control Congress. We can control things like the amount of money, in some cases, that we spend, the amount of money that we save. You participated in a story that the Wall Street Journal did just recently, where a bunch of economists put on their hack hats and gave us some tips about things we actually can do to make a difference in our own financial lives right now. So what did you say in that story? And did you have any other favorite hacks that you want to share?
So, that story, they asked us to think creatively and to think outside the box. And I think my answer was something like, you could do a Kickstarter where you commit to building up an emergency fund, where you ask for support from friends and family, and to say, look, I want to build up a $600 fund, and I commit to not spending it unless it's a medical emergency or some other type of emergency. And if that emergency came up, then the way that crowdfunding works, you could go ahead and report on how helpful it was. That was me trying to be creative. I mean, the real answer is that every person needs to take stock of their risk right now. And if you're in a job, or you have a financial situation where it is plausible that income will dry up, you should change your behavior, unless you've been a terrific saver and you can weather that storm. I personally know a lot of people who are starting to go through layoffs now. And I've also, read the statistics, and we saw 127 million families lose income during the pandemic. So you're in good company. That's the bad news. But like you said, Gene, the good news is that you do have some agency over your individual situation. And so, people can pare back discretionary spending, some of those extras. That's tough right now. I mean, let's be honest, that's tough. I mean, people are just down. I mean, this is a tough thing to live through. And sometimes you feel like, look, maybe I want to go out and buy that extra outfit or whatever to make yourself happier. But if you're facing unemployment, you've got to plan for that.
Yeah.
So there really is no silver bullet. But I think that this will just remind us how fragile our economic situation really is.
Well, and how how difficult it can be to take risks, and how when we take risks, we have to take them in an educated, smart way. Jennifer asked a question about your thoughts on the immediate stock market performance between now and the election. And let me just say, Jennifer, Ben doesn't have a crystal ball. Neither do I. We don't have a crystal ball. But, you know, I do think, I think watching the markets during this time has been a little dangerous, a little maybe a little too confident inspiring. All of those traders on Robinhood are making me more nervous than I like to admit. But I talk about the market, but also in the perspective of knowing that we all do have responsibility for our long-term futures.
Yeah, the market's interesting, and it's been a bit of a conundrum because, for Americans to just see the economy melting down around us and to see boarded up businesses and that get reports of all these big retailers applying for bankruptcy, it's really confusing. And I think that, look, I mean, a strong stock market is a good thing for all those Americans that have money in your 401k or who rely on it for income. And I'm one of those people. I mean, I have a 401k and I'm really happy to see the stock market doing well. But it is a slap in the face for all those people who made good decisions, just like all those 401k savers did, and they're getting laid off for no fault of their own. And I think it's just got to be incredibly tough to be an American who's struggling now, worried about paying your rent, worried about losing your job or maybe having lost a job, and to see, professional investors or people with a lot of liquid wealth just doing great. I think that that's an indication that our economy is flawed in certain ways and needs to be fixed.
It's the K that you're talking about.
Exactly.
Vicky followed that up and would like to hear thoughts on the longer term stock market performance, particularly into 2021. And Vicky, I'm not picking nits, except I am going to pick one or two. 2021 is not long term. I mean, I think that is part of the issue that we are trying to deal with in these weekly chats. When we talk about the fact that we all have to plan on living to be 95, if not 100, I mean, that's long term. Decades are long term. A year or so, if I had money that I needed to use next year in 2021 or 2022, that money would not be in the stock market. That the money that I know I need to use that year, it's not in the stock market because the market, as we saw in March, can tumble really far, really, really fast.
Exactly. I mean, if there's one thing I wish we would change in our country with the way we deal with the economy, is that I would love us to become more long-term oriented. And so, right now we're in a crisis, and when you're in a crisis, when your house is on fire, the thing you worry about most is the water to put out. But there's a lot of things in our economy which just have this inherently short-term focus. And let me give you a couple examples. I mean, the first is that we had this really big tax cut at the end of 2017. I was not a fan of the tax cut. Not because I don't think that corporate investment is a good thing. I do, but the way the tax cut was designed basically rewarded people and businesses, mostly businesses, for doing things they'd already done rather than incenting new investment. And if we were more forward-looking with that $2 trillion, it could have been redesigned in a much smarter way that had us building up educational institutions and our infrastructure, which is crumbling right now. Broadband. I mean, there are people in this country who don't have access to high-speed broadband. You can't participate in the economy if you don't have access to high-speed broadband. And so, one thing that I wish as an economy is that we take a much longer view of productivity, of well-being. We're stuck in this just rut of just looking a few months or even a year ahead, and that's not how you build prosperity. When it comes to the stock market for the long run, I mean, who knows? If I knew, I would be wealthier than I was. But a lot of the stock market valuation is just built on the productivity of the underlying companies. And if we stop investing in things that make companies and people successful, then this will stagnate. And we actually saw this coming into this recession. It's not like we're growing at 5 or 6% a year. Quarter after quarter for the past 3 or 4 years, we were stuck at this 2% growth rate. So, we've got to break out of this short-term cycle. And we know what the investments are, right? It's investments in technology and education and infrastructure and health that make us much more productive. It's just a matter of having the will to make them.
On the subject of health, you have said previously that one of the things that you expect to change most because of this pandemic is the way that we as a country deal with long-term care. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this pandemic it's been devastating to so many Americans, but has really been devastating to older Americans. I mean, we know the fatality rates are so much more concentrated in people who are 60 and older. And there's just been all these different effects which have impacted that group disproportionately. And one thing we've learned is that living facilities, long-term care facilities, nursing homes may not just be safe. And who knows? I mean, I hope this is the last pandemic we ever see.
Please.
But you may see another one. There's no guarantee. And so I think what it's done is had a lot of people question whether or not they want to plan to live in group quarters when they retire. I mean, that's sort of been what you do when you get older. And now it may not be safe. And so people are starting to have to redo their retirement planning and start to ask, well, what happens if I don't feel safe going into an institution? What do I do? Do I have the money to stay in my house? Do I feel comfortable, for a variety of reasons, asking my children if I can come live with them? We've had a long-term care crisis building in this country for a long time, and this pandemic just accelerated it. So that's one of the things we've got to figure out, because no one deserves to work for a whole lifetime and then live in a housing situation where they're unsafe, where they could potentially die.
I had a conversation with a friend this morning whose mother-in-law had to go into the hospital. She's now in a long-term rehab facility. They're not allowed to visit, and they're just thinking in real time about how they move her out of there as quickly as possible. So I think that I think that's a focus group of one, but that you're absolutely right about those trends and the way that we're going to look at that. I think the big question is, how do we pay for it? And how do we, when you mentioned earlier, if you're somebody who's got some assets in a 401k, and you are you have been saving in that vehicle, hopefully you'll be okay. But I've always found that there is a disconnect between saving and turning that money into a support system for the next 30 years that you have in retirement.
Yes. Our retirement system now is basically characterized, and I'll just try to just briefly, describe it, which is, it used to be that half of workers got nothing and half of workers got pensions. And pensions were incredibly reliable. They give you this basically paycheck for life. And then we've had this switch over time, for better or for worse, from traditional pensions to 401ks. Now about half of workers have access to a 401k in every given year. And we have a situation where some people enter retirement with nothing as far as liquid saving. Maybe they have a house, but not a lot saved up in stocks. Some people have very low amounts, and some people have big savings in 401ks. So you've got this really diverse set of circumstances, people coming into retirement. But what's true for everyone is that a lot of people have a hard time taking their savings and turning it into security. And by that, I mean, by security, knowing that you're going to have assets there or income year after year. One of the nice things about owning a house when you enter retirement is that, basically your rent's going to be covered. And a lot of older Americans have paid off their mortgage. And so that's sort of an annuity in a sense, in that, think of a house as an annuity that pays your rent. But a lot of people don't have that security outside of housing. I'm a huge fan of a product called longevity annuities. And so these are annuities that maybe you buy at age 60 or 65 and they kick in 20 years later.
Yeah.
And the reason why I and a lot of other economists like these is they help people deal with the greatest uncertainty you have, which is how long you're going to live. Now, these haven't proven as popular as I think as economists would necessarily like. But the point is that at age 60 or 65, you're staring down all of this uncertainty. Longevity, you don't know how long you're going to live. You don't know what your health outlays were going to be. You don't know what Congress will do if we happen to have a crisis. You don't know if you need to go back to work, whether it'll be safe or whether you can find a job. And by buying a longevity annuity, it takes some of the risk out of your retirement situation. But broadly, as a country, we've got to sort of finish this complete transition between pensions and 401ks, so we give people better options for turning that wealth they've saved for into true security.
I know we're gonna wrap this up shortly, but what do you think it will take to complete that transition? I mean, we now have we now have laws that allow annuities to make their way into 401ks and into the menus there. Is that the first step?
Yeah, that was a big first step. And that was part of the Secure Act, which was passed recently in the last Congress. And it made it easier, as you said, Gene, for 401ks to offer annuity or annuity-like products to their workers. I mean, I think that the way people prepare for retirement is through work. Right. So you earn wages and you pay into Social Security and Medicare, which, by the way, as an aside, have proven their worth through this current crisis. I mean, can you imagine what life would be like for older Americans without Social Security and Medicare? I mean, if you're not convinced now that these are the two of the most important programs in the history of our country, I don't know what it will take.
Yeah.
But those are the bedrock. But people need more than the average of $17,000 you're getting a year through Social Security. And so I think a lot of it just happens with the employer, and that means changing the laws so that employers feel comfortable offering annuities, and a lot of that has to do with liability and other concerns around that, some of which were addressed in the Secure Act, and some of it has to do with just workers' demand and going to your HR department and saying, look, I want a retirement plan where it's not only me saving, but also helping me think through how I'm going to spend my savings in retirement. When annuities are offered in a group option, they often come at better prices for consumers. They have trust in their employer. They're going to select a prudent product for them. So I think a lot of it just comes down to the employer offering the option through a workplace saving plan.
I think that these are issues that we are going to continue talking about for months, for years to come, until we work them out. I know we'll be talking to you. You've got a book coming out on the subject, so we'll definitely talk again then. And thank you so much for just answering so many questions today. It was really, really helpful.
Thanks, Gene. It's my pleasure. Appreciate being on.
Absolutely. And for anybody who's looking for more information, you can go to protectedincome.org. You'll find a lot of resources there, including a list of questions to ask a financial advisor if you're sitting down to have your very first conversation with one. Ben, again, thank you so much, and we'll see you all next week.